Ranked. What scoring systems admit, reward, and erase. You can feel your posture change the moment you're told you'll be scored. You ask what counts, what doesn't, and whether there's a trick. You start rearranging your work, not for truth, not for craft, but for the rubric. Then someone says the score is just a number, as if numbers don't decide access, attention, or dignity. That tension between a number that claims neutrality and a life that experiences consequence is where ranking systems live. Systems that rank people or outputs inevitably encode values through their proxies, and once those scores become portable, the incentives they create will drift behavior toward the score and away from the meaning the score was meant to represent. I will not claim that measurement is evil or that we can live without it. Constraints demand choices, and choices demand some form of evaluation. I will claim something narrower and sharper. The moment you build a scoring system, you build a value statement, you build an incentive, and you build a hierarchy, often an invisible one. And I will name how that hierarchy persists even when the designers are sincere, even when the intent is fairness, even when the score improves on average. Start with plain terms. The topic is measurement, but the real subject is what measurement permits and what it constrains. First term, metric. A metric is a chosen number that stands in for a quality you care about. It is not the quality itself. If you care about learning, you might measure test results. If you care about reliability, you might measure defect rates. If you care about trust, you might measure response time. The metric is the handle you can grab, because the real thing is too complex, too slow, or too expensive to observe directly. Second term, proxy. A proxy is the specific observable signal used to represent something that cannot be fully observed. A metric is often built from proxies. When you cannot directly measure good judgment, you use proxies like speed, consistency, or peer evaluation. When you cannot directly measure impact, you use proxies like clicks, citations, sales, completion, or a supervisor's rating. Proxies are not lies, they are compromises made legible. Third term, ranking. Ranking is what happens when metrics become comparative and scarce resources are attached. Scoring says you have 82. Ranking says you are above them and below them, therefore you get this and not that. Ranking converts measurement into ordering. Ordering becomes a gate. Fourth term, hierarchy. In this context, hierarchy is not merely organizational chart or authority. It is the stratification produced when a score becomes a common currency, portable across contexts, remembered across time, and used to allocate opportunity. A hierarchy is what the system builds when it treats different people as different risks, different investments, different returns. Now state the assumptions plainly. Assumption 1. We measure because we have constraints. Time is limited, money is limited, attention is limited, capacity is limited. When resources are scarce, evaluation becomes necessary. A scoring system is often introduced as a tool to handle scale. We cannot read everything, meet everyone, or verify every claim, so we need a number. Assumption 2. When you measure, you choose. You choose what counts as success, what counts as failure, and what will be ignored as noise. Even if the system says it is objective, the objectivity only applies after the value choices are embedded. Assumption 3. People respond to incentives, not because they are bad, but because they are adaptive. They learn what is rewarded and what is punished. They learn where the rent is, where rewards can be extracted with minimal cost, and they learn where the externalities can be pushed so the system does not charge them. Assumption 4. Portability changes everything. A private note is one thing. A score that follows you is another. A local evaluation might reflect local meaning. A portable score becomes a credential, then a gate, then a worldview. Portability makes comparison cheap, and cheap comparison invites mass ranking. With those terms and assumptions, we can name the central distinction. Metric versus meaning. Meaning is the thing you actually care about. Competence, care, courage, insight, safety, beauty, understanding, integrity, community. Metrics are the numerical shadows you use to operate. Shadows can be useful, but if the institution starts treating the shadow as the person, the system will grow efficient at managing shadows and clumsy at recognizing reality. And that is the start of invisible hierarchy, the hierarchy of what the system can see over what it cannot. Not merely a hierarchy of people, but a hierarchy of legibility. Those who can be cleanly represented by the proxy rise. Those who are real in ways the proxy cannot encode become costly to recognize and therefore easy to exclude. Consider a plain example. Suppose a program wants good contributors. That phrase contains values: collaboration, competence, reliability, creativity, humility, initiative. But the system cannot process all of that at scale. So it selects proxies: number of tasks completed, speed, error rate, and peer ratings. Those are measurable. They are also incomplete. Immediately, a value statement is encoded. Completion is more legible than mentorship. Speed is more legible than caution. Peer ratings are more legible than quiet conflict resolution. The system does not need to say it despises mentorship. It merely needs to omit it. Omission is also encoding. Now add ranking. If the top 10% of scores get access to better projects, higher pay, or more attention, the proxies stop being passive descriptions and start being active levers. The system becomes a game board because the rewards are real. So keep this grounded. Measurement is not just observation. In a system with incentives, measurement is intervention. Ranking is not merely sorting. Ranking is power distribution through a proxy. And one more clarification: critique of scoring is not a plea for pure subjectivity. Subjective judgment also has capture. Favoritism, signaling, charisma, similarity bias, gatekeeping by vibes. A scoring system often arrives as an attempt to reduce those failures, but reducing one failure mode often introduces another. Trade-off is the permanent condition. If you remember nothing else from this grounding, remember this: a ranking system is a compact moral and economic document. It says, this is what we will reward, this is what we will punish, and this is what we will not pay attention to. The central paradox is simple to state and hard to live with. What is measured becomes the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance becomes the culture. A ranking system begins with a promise: portability and comparison. Portability says, you can carry this score into new rooms. Comparison says different people can be evaluated on the same scale. Together they offer speed, decisions made faster, allocations made cleaner, disagreements settled with a number. But portability and comparison are not free. They demand a standardized proxy. Standardization is a constraint disguised as fairness. The system must decide what counts the same across contexts, and whatever it cannot standardize gets pushed out of the official story. Now we reach the first incentive loop, an individual level loop. Incentive loop 1, individual. Score, access, resources, ability to produce score. When a score grants access, better training, better tools, better opportunities, better networks, that access increases the person's capacity to achieve the proxies that raise the score. This is not necessarily corruption, it is reinforcement. The system can call it meritocracy and still be describing a feedback loop. The person with access produces more of what the metric rewards, which produces more access. The hierarchy hardens because the score is both evaluation and investment. That loop creates an individual level failure mode. Identity capture. Individual failure mode: people begin to manage themselves as portfolios optimized for the proxy. They stop asking, what is true, and start asking, what will be legible. They stop building deep competence and start building shallow signals. They stop taking necessary risks that might reduce the score in the short run. They choose the safe work, the visible work, the countable work. They may become less honest with themselves, not because they chose deception, but because adaptation can be quiet. When the environment rewards a story, the mind learns to live inside that story. A ranking system also creates a second incentive loop: system level. Incentive loop 2, institutional. Metric improves, legitimacy increases, reliance increases, metric defines reality. The system introduces a score and watches the numbers move. The numbers moving creates a sense of control. That sense of control becomes legitimacy. We are improving. Legitimacy increases reliance. Decisions defer to the metric because it appears consistent. Reliance increases capture. The metric becomes the official reality because it is the only reality the institution can process at scale. This loop creates a system-level failure mode: proxy drift. System failure mode: the metric becomes a target, and the system adapts to hit the target while losing the original purpose. Proxy drift does not require bad actors. It requires a stable reward attached to a simplified signal. The stronger the reward, the faster the drift. People innovate around constraints. They find gaming strategies. They shift externalities onto places the metric does not see. Over time, the metric measures less of what it was supposed to measure and more of what it takes to satisfy the metric. This is where the quiet danger lives. Not a dramatic betrayal, but a gradual substitution. A system says it wants quality, then measures speed of delivery, and soon it teaches everyone that speed is quality. The system says it wants understanding, then measures recall under timed conditions, and soon it teaches everyone that understanding is recall. The system says it wants trust, then measures response time, and soon it teaches everyone that trust is immediacy. The proxy is not neutral, it is a teacher. Underneath this sits the deeper contradiction. Ranking systems promise fairness through uniformity, but uniformity is not the same as justice. Uniformity means the same proxy applied to different lives, but different lives are different constraints. One person has time to shape work to the rubric, another has constraints that make the rubric costly. One person has a mentor who knows how the scoring works, another is learning the rules while being judged by them. One person is fluent in the institution's language, another speaks the truth in an accent the proxy cannot parse. When the system ranks, it does not merely compare outputs, it compares the ability to produce the kind of output that can be compared. That is a hidden value, legibility over depth, conformity over context. Now address the claim many systems make: we're just measuring what matters. If a system could measure what matters directly, it would not need proxies. The need for a proxy is an admission of distance. That distance is where values enter. And this is where we place one disciplined sentence, because it is the heart of the paradox. What you measure, you serve. Serving the measure can be rational and still be tragic. It can produce local efficiency and global loss. Now consider how incentives create capture without malice. A ranking system rarely begins as an attempt to dominate. It begins as an attempt to manage. People feel overwhelmed. They feel the cost of ambiguity. They want a shared standard to reduce conflict and speed decisions. They also want protection against favoritism. Let the score decide, not a private preference. Good intentions can be genuine. Here is the paragraph that must be said plainly. Good intentions still produce capture. Because once a score is tied to reward, it creates rent. Rent is the value that can be extracted not by producing the underlying good, but by satisfying the gate's condition. Anyone who wants to help will still face pressure to show improvement in the approved numbers. Anyone who wants to be fair will still face pressure to apply the metric consistently, because consistency is the easiest defense. Anyone who wants to keep their job will still face pressure to report progress in the language the system accepts. None of that requires cruelty. It requires incentives, and it requires a proxy. Now move from capture to hierarchy. Ranking produces a ladder, but the ladder is built out of the system's values. Every rung is a claim. This is the kind of person we can safely invest in. This is the kind of output we can confidently reward. When the score becomes portable, the ladder extends beyond the original context. People begin to live as if the ladder is reality itself. Portability also makes mistakes durable. A local evaluator can update their view when they see new evidence. A portable score is slow to forgive because its function is to be stable enough to compare. Stability is a feature for coordination, but stability becomes a constraint on redemption. A number that travels must be trusted by strangers, therefore it must be resistant to reinterpretation. This resistance can be efficient and still be unjust. Now name another paradox. Systems prefer metrics that are hard to contest. A metric that is arguable invites debate. Debate costs time. Time costs money. So institutions choose proxies that are convenient, clean, and defensible. Defensibility selects for what can be audited and logged, not for what is true. The system becomes safer from argument and less sensitive to reality. This is how invisible hierarchies are built, not with explicit declarations of worth, but with repeated choices of convenience over meaning, legibility over nuance, auditability over understanding. And once these hierarchies exist, they shape behavior even when no one is watching. People internalize the ranking. They pre-optimize their days around it. At this point, you can see the full structure. Constraint demands evaluation. Evaluation demands proxies. Proxies encode values through omissions and emphasis. Ranking attaches rewards and punishments. Rewards and punishments create incentive loops. Incentive loops produce drift and capture. Drift and capture harden into hierarchy. None of this requires villainy. It requires a system with limited attention and a desire for control. Now look at the ultimate tension. Meaning is not fully computable. Meaning lives in context, intention, and relationship, things that resist standardization. The more a system must scale, the more it reaches for standardization. The more it standardizes, the more it reduces meaning into proxy. The system becomes powerful at moving numbers, and weak at recognizing what the numbers were supposed to stand for. That is not a moral complaint. It is a design reality. It is a trade-off, and the trade-off has consequences. Second-order effects are where measurement becomes culture. The first-order effect of a ranking system is sorting. The second-order effect is shaping the population that remains. the work that gets attempted, and the meaning people assign to their own lives. Consequence 1. Behavioral substitution. When a proxy becomes the currency, people substitute the proxy for the underlying goal, not because they are stupid, but because they are constrained. If the system pays for the proxy becomes the job. The underlying goal becomes a slogan. You can watch this happen in any environment where evaluation is frequent and consequential. Work becomes optimized for visibility. Tasks that can be counted, artifacts that can be logged, outputs that fit the template. Quiet contributions, mentorship, prevention, maintenance, careful thought become externalities. They matter, but they are unpaid in the currency of rank. Consequence 2. Risk aversion and the flattening of ambition. Ranking systems often punish variance. The simplest scoring rules reward consistent compliance. That creates a selection pressure against experimentation, because experimentation creates outliers, and outliers are costly to explain. Over time, the system trains people to avoid the kind of risk that produces real discovery. It does not ban creativity, it taxes it. Consequence 3. Stratification by legibility. Those who can easily translate their work into the proxy rise. Those whose value is real but hard to encode become unproven. The system becomes a machine for promoting the easily measurable and discounting the difficult to measure. This creates invisible hierarchy, not just the hierarchy of performance, but the hierarchy of representability. People learn that the way to be treated as competent is to be interpretable by the metric. Consequence 4. Feedback becomes less honest. When rankings decide outcomes, feedback becomes strategic. Peers, supervisors, reviewers, anyone involved in scoring learn that their evaluations have consequences. Some become cautious, some become political, some become generous to avoid conflict, some become harsh to signal standards. The evaluation channel becomes a battleground of incentives. This is not only about malice, it is about the cost of truth. If telling the full truth harms someone in a system that cannot absorb nuance, people will simplify. They will compress reality into what the form can hold. The form becomes the ceiling of honesty. Consequence 5. The persistence of early advantage. Because scores are portable, early conditions matter more. If the score at one stage controls access to resources at the next stage, the system amplifies early differences. This can look like consistent excellence, but function like compounding. The system becomes less a detector of talent and more a compounding engine for initial conditions. Consequence 6. The rise of intermediary industries. Wherever a gate exists, someone will sell a map of the gate. Training programs, coaching, templates, and optimization techniques emerge. Some of this is legitimate skill building. Some of it is pure gaming, teaching people how to satisfy the proxy without building the underlying capacity. This is not surprising. It is an economic law. A valuable metric creates a market for metric performance. The system calls it preparation. The incentives call it rent extraction. The trade-off is that access becomes partially purchasable through proxy optimization rather than earned through meaning. Consequence 7. Measurement-induced inequality of attention. Ranking systems do not only allocate money or access, they allocate attention. High-scored outputs get surfaced, promoted, shared, and repeated. Low-scored outputs become invisible. The system becomes an amplifier, not just measuring what is valued, but manufacturing what is visible. This has a compounding effect on identity and culture. People imitate what gets attention. New entrants learn the style and the substance that performs well on the metric. Diversity of approach narrows, not by explicit censorship, but by incentive. Consequence 8. Moral outsourcing. When a score is treated as objective, decision-makers can hide behind it. The number decided. This reduces the felt burden of judgment. It can also reduce accountability for the values encoded in the proxy. If harms occur, the system can claim it merely followed the metric. This is a subtle externality. The institution saves psychological and legal cost by transferring responsibility to a number. But responsibility does not disappear. It becomes harder to locate. Consequence 9. The hidden cost of standardization. To rank at scale, you need categories. Categories are constraints. They simplify people into types. The more the system depends on those categories, the more it treats exceptions as errors. Yet real skill, real learning, and real resilience often live in the exceptions. the unconventional path, the delayed bloom, the uneven profile, the person who is strong in ways the template did not anticipate. A ranking system can acknowledge this in theory and still discard it in practice, because exceptions are expensive to process. Consequence 10. Loss of meaning through over-optimization. When life is lived through proxies, the self becomes managerial. People experience themselves as dashboards. They become anxious about numbers and numb about purpose. Even when they win, the win can feel hollow, because the metric cannot certify meaning. Notice what I am not doing. I am not predicting catastrophe. I am describing predictable trade-offs. Rankings create coordination and accountability. They also create drift, gaming, and hierarchy. The question is not whether ranking works. The question is, works for what? And at whose expense? Second-order effects persist because ranking systems become infrastructure. Once a score is used across multiple decisions, it becomes hard to remove. People build plans around it. Institutions build processes around it. Entire pipelines and career paths, admission paths and funding paths depend on the number. Even those harmed by it may still prefer it to the chaos of unaccountable discretion. That is why invisible hierarchies are durable. They are stabilized by convenience. They reduce transaction costs. They settle arguments quickly. And when a system reduces costs, it earns defenders, even if it distorts meaning. The score becomes the common language, and a common language, once established, is hard to replace. So the consequence is not merely behavioral change, it is epistemic change. The system starts to know itself through the metric. What cannot be scored becomes harder to talk about, harder to fund, harder to defend. Ranking systems do not just allocate opportunities. They shape what a community believes is real, what it believes is possible, and what it believes is worth doing. That is the weight of a number. Not because numbers are magical, but because numbers are portable, and portability is power. There is no clean exit from measurement. The world has constraints, and constraints demand choices. The question is not whether we will use proxies, but whether we will remember they are proxies. A disciplined reflection begins by noticing where the score sits in the chain of causality. Is the metric a thermometer, or is it a thermostat? A thermometer reports. A thermostat controls. Many systems pretend their metrics are thermometers while they function as thermostats, actively shaping behavior by attaching reward. Then notice what the system makes expensive. Every metric makes some behaviors cheap and some behaviors costly. It makes some stories easy to tell and others hard to tell. It makes some kinds of people legible and others suspicious. It makes some paths smooth and others steep. Those costs are not accidents. They are the system's values expressed as friction. If you want to see the encoded values, look at the appeals process. When someone says, the score is wrong, what happens next? If the system has no room for contest, then the value is not truth, it is throughput. If contest is allowed only through paperwork and documentation, then the value is not lived reality, it is auditability. If contest is allowed only for those with time, language, and confidence, then the value is not fairness, it is procedural compliance. If you want to see the values, look at what is treated as an externality. What labor is relied upon but unmeasured? What maintenance is invisible? What care is assumed? What long-term risk is pushed into the future because the metric is short-term? The system will not confess these things in its mission statement. It will confess them in what it refuses to count. If you want to see capture, look at who benefits from the proxy staying the same. Stability is not neutral. Once people have adapted, invested, and built advantage around a metric, they will resist changes that threaten their position. Sometimes they will argue for standards. Sometimes they will argue for objectivity. Sometimes they will argue for consistency. Those arguments can be sincere and still function as protection of rent. So what do we do with this clarity if we refuse neat answers? We hold attention without romanticizing either side. Pure quantification is not wisdom, it is a management technique. Pure intuition is not justice, it is often unaccountable power. A system can be made less arbitrary by measurement and made less meaningful by measurement at the same time. Both can be true. We also admit a hard truth. Values cannot be smuggled out of a system. They are in the proxy selection, the weighting, the time horizon, the tolerance for variance, the treatment of exceptions, and the cost of appeal. The only question is whether the values are explicit enough to be discussed or hidden enough to be enforced without consent. and we practice a kind of attention that is not glamorous, attention to incentives, not because incentives explain everything, but because incentives explain what repeats, incentives explain what scales, incentives explain why good people produce outcomes they did not intend, incentives reveal the quiet forces that turn a metric into a worldview. So sit with a final tension. A score can be useful. It can reduce some kinds of unfairness. It can coordinate large groups. It can protect against favoritism. And it can also create an invisible hierarchy that outlives its justification. It can turn people into objects of comparison. It can teach them to optimize for legibility rather than meaning. It can become a portable identity that is hard to escape. No neat resolution is coming because the trade-off is real. The only honest posture is to see the proxy as a tool, see the tool as a value statement, and see the value statement as a distribution of power, and then to leave space for a question that cannot be computed. What would you honor if no one could rank it?